I guess I forgot to mention for the presenters, when you're up here, if you have slides, if you're just doing slides, you can actually stand right up here, and we are recording so that
live streaming.
Woo! People are watching.
Thanks to Stuart. Awesome. Well, hello. I'm going to talk about Ember, not because I'm an Ember expert. Actually, I started teaching myself Ember less than 2 months ago, but because as I was starting to do that, I discovered some things that addressed some problems I've seen in recent developments in the online ecosystem. I'm a longtime web developer. I started out mostly on the server side. Now I'm doing mostly client stuff. And there are some things that we all tackle, and this talk is more about those. In fact, it's mostly about information hierarchy. So information hierarchies are everywhere on the web. They're everywhere in our lives, but we care about the web here. What are some examples of those? So HTML. How are we writing our web pages? It's all hierarchical. We have this document structure that pretty much defines what we're capable of doing and what we're doing. Everything is written in a hierarchy. We're constantly thinking about hierarchies. Almost all content is naturally hierarchical. You're thinking about what are you saying at a high level? Let's dive into details. What are the main points? Now details for each point. The best way for someone to absorb content is in this sort of deep dive hierarchical manner, and then almost all of our applications are naturally hierarchical. Let's look at some examples. A few of you have seen this website before. Where is the hierarchy on Amazon's website? If we look at this page, we can see top level, we've got our nav bar. That kind of persists everywhere. We can always search. We can go around. Jumping in, you've got a sub-level. I searched on something that Amazon decided, oh, this is probably books. So it's showing me a sub-level of hierarchy that is books. Even more, I have on the left-hand side, diving into different types of books. I searched for best JavaScript books. There's all sorts of different computing books I might be looking at. And down, finally, we're getting to our meat of the subject here, which is the actual products that they're showing us. So we have 4 levels of hierarchy on just one simple Amazon search. So this is a solved problem, right? I mean, we've been doing this forever. As mentioned, this shows up in every application. This shows up in any time we're representing content. And all of our server-side frameworks have ways for us that have kind of figured out how to do this. We've got layouts, we render things into layouts, we deal with partials, but what happens when we move into the brand new open world of single-page applications? So I looked around for what type of framework support is available. I mostly work in Backbone, and I know that this is kind of painful in Backbone. There's ways you can do it. Marionette has this idea of a layout view, and you can put in child views and communicate, but communicating between the layers is really challenging. I looked at Angular. Now, I'm not an Angular expert, but as far as I could tell, there's no support in Angular core for hierarchical arrangement of views. In fact, when I started searching for it, people said, well, this plugin. No, this plugin. This is the best plugin that I found with the biggest support was this UI router plugin. And I started digging into it a little bit, and it looked too deep, too fast, so I wasn't really sure what to go there. Maybe we can get a talk about that later in the Angular group. And I looked also at Meteor. And Meteor, of these 3, was probably the worst. I searched for it, and I found dozens of Stack Overflow questions saying, how do you do this? And nobody answering them. So, yes, you can do things here a little bit, but really when you say support, what does it mean for a framework to support this? I mean, if you build nesting in a JavaScript application in Backbone, it ends up looking something like this, where what you're trying to create is this on the left. You've got a page, it's got sub-pieces within it, the piece inside has additional pieces below it. And the way that you end up modeling that in your single-page application is as a bunch of different views, and then you're manually plugging them together and saying, okay, if they update this one, then that one needs to know, and this one should listen for events on its children over here. And it's very manual because you have a framework that is essentially flat. but what you're modeling with it is essentially hierarchical. Now, it's not all bad. There are a couple of frameworks that address this head on. So the first one is React. React actually is probably the most extreme about this. They are very, very vigilant about hierarchy, and they have this owner-ownee relationship where this component owns all of its child components, and every child component knows who it's owned by, so it's very dictated who is responsible for what and who the parents are and who the children are. And the other framework that supports this is Ember, as I learned when I started teaching myself Ember in the last couple of weeks. The core architecture of the view layer of Ember is around this idea of nested components and nested routes. And so in these frameworks, when you're implementing the same application where you've got the different nested pieces, your models, the way that you're modeling it in your view layer is also nested. So it's a core piece of how you're representing suddenly is now lined up with what it is you're trying to represent. So let's look a little bit at what Ember does with this. And actually, we'll step back a little bit and talk a little about Ember first. How many people here are familiar with Ember? Have used it? A little less than half. That's actually better than I was expecting. That's pretty good. So in Ember, a view is typically automatically created by a template. So you will have a template that's written in handlebars, and the view representation in JavaScript is often automatically generated. It's connected to a route and a controller, which we'll talk about more what those are in a minute. And they're arranged hierarchically. So as you're going into your Ember application, if we were recreating Amazon, each of those would have its parent and child relationships. The whole thing would be represented in the JavaScript in a hierarchical manner. And events will bubble up from the bottom to the top of the hierarchy. Now, before we dive into more details about what all these things are, for the half of you who didn't raise your hand, let's refresh ourselves on what Ember.js is. It's a JavaScript MVC. It's extremely opinionated with strong conventions that turns some people off, that excites other people quite a bit. And there's an emphasis on URLs representing state, which is really what ends up driving this hierarchical approach. As you go to different URLs within your application, the way that they structure the URLs represents the state of where you are in the application and its relationships. And so that then ends up driving your views in this hierarchical manner to create what the user finally interacts with. So let's go into what are all the pieces that make this happen. And there's a lot, but don't worry because they simplify it. So there's a router, which handles what URL goes to where in the hierarchy. There's a route, which sets up for your view. There's a controller, which handles quote-unquote view logic, which things like, okay, if I click on this, this needs to change how it interacts. This needs to look something different. There's a view, which handles quote-unquote interaction events. So if I'm hovering over this, I want it to expand in some way, something that's not changing state, but is kind of dealing with my interactions. And there's the template, which we're all familiar with templates. That's a lot of different pieces to get the job done, but luckily, you often only need two of them because Ember will automatically fill in the details for a lot of the stuff in the middle with smart defaults, and then you can edit it if you need some of the things changed. So we are a technical meetup. Let's jump into some code and see what this looks like. So, oh, that is depressingly not readable on here. Can you read that? No. Let's. Oh. Okay, can you read that? All right, so this is a router from a little demo application that I was creating. And first off, let's get over a couple of the weird JavaScriptisms. So Ember has dived in hard on the ECMAScript 6 approach. So all of the files that you're writing in Ember today are going to be ES6 modules. So this whole import syntax and the we've now scrolled past the point where you can see the export, but we'll see that in the next one. This stuff is coming from ECMAScript ES6. I cannot say ECMAScript to save my life. ECMAScript 6. It's similar to Node Require or AMD or anything like that. It's just the one that's going to be standardized on, and so they're jumping in on it early. What we're doing is we're taking this router object and we're defining an instance, we're extending it, and creating our URLs. So we're going to say, okay, we're going to have a friends resource of some sort. So in the URL, that's going to start as /friends, and we're going to route or nest some routes under it. So there's going to be a new route, creating CRUD essentially. There's going to be a show route. It's going to have an ID in the path, and there's going to be an edit route that also has the ID in the path. This is telling Ember about the hierarchy and how it maps onto your URLs. And this is the basis of creating this hierarchy of views. This is going to show up in a couple of interesting ways. It'll even let me move to the next one in this. So we can't see the whole slides because I'm zoomed in, but when we start looking at templates, those templates are going to end up nesting in exactly the same way. So if we look at my friends template, it's very simple. It's just a high level, here's the wrapper that's going to be around any friends route, and this funky little handlebars variable called outlet. And outlet is an Emberism. For those of you who've done any Rails, it's like yield within Rails or ERB and Ruby. It's basically saying, whatever content comes later, plug it in here. And then we can define, for those nested routes that we mentioned, individual templates. So a show template might look like this, where we've just got, okay, here's our first name, our last name, our email, various other things. And what's going to happen is Ember's going to glue all that together. It's going to take the router, simplified in this case. It's going to have an implicit route controller and view that are just going to figure out the right thing. So if we're looking at the new friends model, it's just going to put an empty model in there that I can start filling out. And it's going to take these two things and it's going to combine them because it's going to plug in that bottom level template into the outlet. So our hierarchy as expressed by templates is now generating this nice hierarchical HTML as we would expect. Let's see, we're still, I wonder if I can get back into play mode and get what I want. Let's see this. So we start talking about routes. It's really invisible on this, but at a high level, Ember's going to do the right thing for routes, but you can define a route for each one of these layers. So you can define a route, in this case I'm doing an empty for the friends overarching resource, and then when you jump down one level to new, saying I want to create a new model, you can define a route that says, hey, let's create a record here. I wonder if there's any way I can zoom these. That's really unfortunate. I'm going to try again to zoom, but just... Apologize for that. No, it won't let me zoom in. So we'll just do a couple more code snippets, and then we'll be back to something that's nice and visible. So looking at another example, I want to talk about actions and something we're actually going to interact with rather than show. So I'm going to introduce the new template, where we have a few things going on. We not only have a template, but we've got these sort of inserted actions, where we say, okay, on submit, I want to do save. Or if you hit cancel, I want to do cancel. And this is how Ember starts to handle events. So when you're generating a template, you can insert in there, here's how I want to trigger an event. You do this thing, trigger this event. And where does that end up going? My clicker stopped working. That's really killing it. I apologize. I'm going to play it and I'm going to skip the code samples and we can come back to that. Your actions will then talk to the different controllers and routes, and that's when you're going to end up actually defining those things rather than using their sensible defaults. So if you have an action that you want to do, you can define how it's going to be handled with the controller. So in this case, you can't see it, but we define what save does. It saves it to the back end. We define what cancel does. So you plug all these things together, and you end up with a simple route, a controller that does a few things in your template. And here's what it actually ends up looking like. And this is what I was skipping forward to because of the visibility problem. You have data coming down from the route. So if we were to route to friends new, that new route is going to set up a model that it's going to then pass down to the controller. The controller will pass it down to the view. The view will pass it down to the template, and it'll render out this template. Actions go back up, or events go back up the other way. So if I click submit within my template, it triggered that save action I mentioned. That's going to go up to the view. If the view doesn't know how to handle it, it'll pass it up to the controller. The controller doesn't know how to handle it, it'll pass it back up to the route. At each stage, it can actually do something and continue passing it, or it can do what's in the old JavaScript language, prevent default, essentially, where it says, okay, I'm done, stop propagating this up. Where this gets really interesting is when you start bringing back in that nesting idea. So within each view, data flows down, but then events can flow up, 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 and then if this route doesn't prevent the default, it'll bubble up to the route above it and the route above it. So say that I am Amazon and I click on that product. If I'm an SPA, I no longer have the opportunity on the server to re-render everything and be happy. If I want to change those things, I need to know about it. And in this case, as it bubbles up, each layer can change what's appropriate for it based on the actions happening down at the bottom. So what, right? Like, what's the point? Some things that this means is that building this way allows you to create a representation for your view that matches the actual visual organization. And if there's one thing we've learned as programmers, it's that the closer your model can match to the actual work you're trying to do, the easier it is to think about it and reason about it. It also allows you to place event handlers where they belong in the hierarchy. So if there's something that needs to be dealt with at the very top level, you don't have to worry about who am I observing and how am I getting to this child view. You just have to let things ripple up naturally to where they belong. And I kind of already mentioned this, but it allows you to do easy updates of related views. So if you're Amazon and you're going around different products, you can change what's showing in the extra recommended products. You can change what's showing in the sidebar. You can even change what's available in the search area. So apologize about the code issue, and I don't have too much more on this because we're keeping it short and because I would have liked to have a few more examples of what we could do with this, but I ran out of time. So I'm going to skip straight to questions. Yes, sir.
So in the case where you do have a cousin views that want to talk with one another, is that by overriding the view or the controller you can achieve that? Or?
So when you say cousin or siblings, basically, where you have them next to one another, so there are a couple ways you can do that within Ember. So they do actually support observers, so you could have observers. Or you could go to more of the React style, where basically you have the event bubble up, and then that changes some data, which then trickles down, which is how I would tend to do it. I think the mantra that React popularized and Ember has really jumped on is the idea that you want to deal with state you take state up to the highest level, and then trickle down all the impacts as they go, and it makes your application much easier to reason about. Yes?
I find it kind of interesting that you're using as the purpose for a nested application using for search, because to me, especially as a client-side application, it seems to be one of the worst possible examples of what you might want to execute with client-side code, which is some sort of faceted search on the, it seems to me that at least the code that I've been looking at, that you really need, in order to, unless you're willing to download an enormous amount of data and use a tremendous amount of client-side processing to do your, to do the parsing, to execute your queries against it, you almost have to do this server side, and and whatever your faceted search might be, depending on your search engine, that will depend on what you might be able to do with your client-side code. I find it interesting that you're suggesting that you can use a client-side framework to somehow execute this magic on doing the faceted search.
Well, so I think there's two questions wrapped up there, so let me try to address them. First of all, I don't think the way that you're rendering and the way that you're generating your results are necessarily correlated, right? So like I've actually written an engine that basically did a set of faceted searches, submitted it as a JSON query, which then got parsed and passed to Solr, which passed back a list of results, which were passed back up as JSON. And it was much easier to reason about the relationship between checking and unchecking things than trying to re-render the whole entire thing. So I think, I don't know the search applications you've been looking at, but I think it is a reasonable place to use a client-side approach. The second question is kind of a bigger question of what's appropriate in general to do on the client side. When is it something that's beneficial to put things on the client versus the server? And that is one that I think is an ongoing and outstanding question. There's a popular trend to try to put more and more and more on the client, and there are different reasons for that, and I think that your decision processes there are going to definitely depend on the business and technical details of the problem. So search in particular, we should discuss more because I'm curious the problem you're running into there, but bigger picture, it's an unsolved problem. Which one should we be using? It depends on your case. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so is there a vendor provide a mechanism to make these views indexable by searching without hacking and sort of cherry-picking the search type?
Yeah, so that's a really good question for any single-page application. There is a not very good mechanism in place right now and a very good mechanism under development. So they are currently under development something they're calling Ember Fast Boot, which is essentially I'm going to compare it to an isomorphic application where basically you can render either server or client side. It'll render on the server and then wire itself out. You can do something right now that will render Ember applications on the server, but they don't then wire up properly on the client, so it's only applicable for search engines. But where they're going is render server, render client, and then if you render on the server, once it gets up there, it'll bootstrap the application. Yes?
Does it provide a mechanism to render a view without having touch to it?
So every view has an implicit route. Or do you mean render a template?
Yeah, so like say you wanted to display it like notification, right? We don't actually want to update the
Yeah, they have a partials mechanism.
Okay.
So they can do that. Yeah, the language gets a little different. So any view is associated with a route, but a partial can be essentially a rendered template with logic or what have you. Other questions? Okay, if you'd like to actually read the code samples, I'll post the slides, and then if I'm going to give this a talk again, I'll need to figure out how do I make those large